How's it going, guys? And welcome back to the channel. Today, we are starting on our mini-series of PCL-related content that I wanted to do prior to the auction. And for this video, I wanted to talk about the differences in drafting compared to your standard small run draft or any Amon event. However, for this topic, I am not alone. I decided that I needed to recruit the help of someone who would be a little bit more experienced than me. This man has captained in basically every event under the sun, and is somehow still doing it. Welcome to the channel, Mr. DSX.
Hello. I have been captaining since 2019, probably even earlier than that, because EPL season 1 was 2017. Maybe, 2019 sounds about right, but yeah.
Yeah, it was the last week of December 2018.
Yeah, here I am, captaining the next DCL season again, Wisconsin.
Yeah, he doesn't know how to stop, guys. And for those of you that don't know, because you're newbies, this man is the reason I got drafted in DPL 1 in the first place. So I owe all my relevancy to him.
I got the, 7.5k for TJ.
I think it was 7.5?
It might have been next year. I don't exactly remember, but you did put up a 5-2 record.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't too bad. Anyways, that's not what this video is for. I wanted to cover the differences in terms of drafting approach, and I felt that you were the best person to bring on because for some reason you've always had a knack of finding the right thing to draft at the right time, and that has definitely led to a lot of drafts having success and so many instances where your teams just dominate in regular seasons. Do you think there's any kind of particular reason that happens? Is that something that you do particularly going into drafting week? Is it more an auction thing? You got any thoughts?
I think a lot of it is just sort of being able to identify what you believe is good rather than just following the tier list. Because I think a lot of traps people fall into is that they always just end up picking the expensive ones, right? Like you see, let's say, Palafin at 17 points. And you're like, okay, that has to be around 1 or around 2 Pokemon, since it's one of the top 5 most expensive Pokemon. Whereas, I think you should more so be identifying what you believe is strong in the meta, and then prioritizing picking those up and building your pieces around that, rather than just following a tier list. Because you see a lot of the time, tier lists gets shifted a lot as seasons progress, right? You see Hydrapple jump from 9 points to 16 points recently, and that's because people, I guess in this case, Yeardunk was willing to experiment with it. So I think a lot of it is just being able to identify what your preferences are and then what you think will do well. Because I think there are obviously people who enjoy using Palafin. I'm not one of those people, so you will never see me using a Palafin. But if you're able to identify what you or your team is able to use proficiently, I think that's the recipe to success for a good draft.
Yeah, and just to preface this, guys, for this video, we're only going to focus on Generation 9, because we're trying to cover every draft process for every generation. We won't be here all day. And I don't think, fun fact, we have just been yapping for the last 40 minutes before we even hitting the record button. So, we know the two of us like to talk, so we would be here all day, and, I'd like to keep some sort of viewer retention, so we're only going to focus on Gen 9. And just what you said in terms of recognizing a mon that you think is good, regardless of its price value, that leads us in nicely to DPL Season 7, where there is two very particular mons that kind of come into the context here, being Hurricane Gambit and Hisuian Samurai. These were two mons that were not kind of seen in such a positive light at the beginning of SV, and I think it was you and Pig Takers in general using these mons in the way that you did, having two of them, and just kind of showing their potential, and that led to them kind of ballooning up in tier list.
Yeah,
what was it that kind of attracted you to these mons?
I guess I couldn't really tell you why these Pokemon weren't as highly thought. In the sort of SV, I do have a theory for King Gambit is because historically speaking, Pokemon that are slow with 4-time weaknesses usually never do great in draft. And at this point, we were still not unfamiliar with how impactful Terror would be when it comes to its influence on a Pokemon. And I think that's partially what influenced Kingambit to be this low in the tier list, because people assume that like, oh, you can tech a fighting move onto anything. You can tech like Focus Blast on I don't know, some random Pokemon, and then you'll be able to cover for the Kingambit pretty reliably. But that just turned out not to be the case because of how pretty much broken Terra was at that time when it came to setup sweepers. And I think this season, specifically during the start of SB, it was when versatile setup sweepers dominated the draft pretty much. You see like Terra Volcarona, Terra Kingambit, Terra Annihilate, all of these guys, Terra Shufu, they have like Swords Dance, Bulk Up, Quiver Dance. All of these guys can Terra into your defensive or offensive typing, and then be able to sort of just sweep an endgame if people are not prepared for it carefully. And at this point, it was really hard to prepare for these mons, especially at the start of the generation. And as for Samurott, I'm not exactly sure why Samurott went under the radar. I feel like if you talk about it now, the ability to spikes up while having a 105 base power move sounds absolutely ridiculous. So I guess this one was always on. I remember it was Glop and I. We were both very huge on this Pokemon back then. And we were like, oh, I guess we can just pick it up. And like, there's no reason not to get two because we believed in it. And it ended up working out pretty nicely.
Yeah, 100%. And also what you said in regards to this was the season for a versatile set of sweepers. It was also the season where we saw a fall off in one-dimensional set of sweepers. The best example, that I think you were probably a large part of this as well, was Terra Sparta.
Yeah, I thought Terra Sparta was dog shit. And it turned out to be dog shit, as I was predicted correctly. Mainly because of how, as you said, one-dimensional it is. Actually, I think I know why Samurott probably wasn't viewed as greatly back then. It's probably because people were still pretty, they still wanted to draft a bulky water type when it came to their draft. And then Samurott is obviously more of an offensive piece than a defensive water. So it probably went under the radar for most people since they would rather prioritize like, I don't know, like Rotom Wash or, I don't know what other defensive waters there are, like a Azumarill maybe. Something that has more defensive capability with its typing than Samurott. But little did people realize in SV, you want your defensive Pokemon to be able to exert defensive capability as well. And we even see that like nowadays where we have people running Adamant on Alomomola. You run attack EVs on like your defensive Pokemon just for it to be able to not be a sitting duck a lot of the time. And that same philosophy applies to a lot of these Pokemon like Samurott, where you can put Assault Vest on it. And it is tanky enough to be able to switch them once or twice. And that's all you pretty much need for it to win a game.
Yeah. Another thing to tack on that we kind of thought about was that this was a point of generation where I don't think people realized how strong spikes were, because people were grabbing Pokemon Froggers and things like that. And I don't think, obviously this was really important for that, so yes, they kind of knew removal was a problem, but people still didn't commit to the spike stack route.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is actually as well, like, and this is something you'll see in later drafts as well. Spikes or hazard in general, plus a ghost type, became very influential in the SV meta. And you see in both cases here, the Samurott team in SV2 is paired with Annihilate, and SV3 is paired with Drifloon. And obviously the ghost is there to spin block. But we'll see how this evolves in the future with Tinglu plus Sableye, Tinglu plus Rotom, Ghost, and then numerous Spike users with cheap Ghost types in general. And it's pretty much a given now that if you draft a predominant Spike user, you always have to pair it with a Ghost type. And this wasn't something that was as established back then, I want to say. Like people definitely had it on their mind. They're like, oh, I need a spin block, but like you would get like, they wouldn't put as much emphasis on it as they would nowadays, I'd say.
100%. And this was also practically a petulant existence. And we all
Yes. Yes.
So I guess we can quickly move on from this season, and that brings us to GCL Season 1, which, yes, this is a screenshot, that is because the BCL Season 1 drafting doc now looks like a giant pile of ass. So, it's the cleanest way we can present it. So I guess it's you look at this and there's nothing that's too out of the ordinary here. I guess the big one is actually talking about that FB4, because there was moves made on this in the mid-season to kind of pick up Ursa Blood Moon, which was a mon that was picking up serious traction as this season was going on, to the point where at the end of this BCL, Ursa Blood Moon was paramount. So do you want to kind of go into that mindset of how you approach a mid-season and what would lead to you wanting to make changes to a draft? And would it be because you're kind of tapping that trend because you realize, oh, Terra Ursa Blood Moon is like stupid good? Or was it just a case of Terra Ursa Blood Moon is better than the options that I had, which was a Terra Manaphy, for those that didn't know?
Right. In this case, this was DCL 1 coincided right around when I think it's called Indigo Disc or whatever the first DLC for SV was called.
Teal Mask, yeah.
Teal Mask, sorry. Yeah, Teal Mask dropped. So a lot of things were pretty fresh in terms of new Pokemon and just what is good in general. Like nobody knew what is good basically in the first week. Like we cheered all like Monopon. Like all forms Ogerpon at 16 points. And Terra Manaphy at 16 points. And then it get pretty quickly, you can tell in like the first 2 weeks of the season, like what mons are actually good and what mons are frauds. In this case, Terra Manaphy was very obviously a fraud. Like on paper it seems great. You have Terra, you have a versatile Terra option. There's a different set of options, so just take Heart and Yoga. But if you look at the sort of successful Terra captains that have been the cornerstone of the draft up until now, a lot of them are very bulky as well, and very bulky set of sweepers. Like, you remember we were looking at Annihilate, King Gambit, all of these guys, you would invest like max HP into these guys, you put Adamant, and then you put like a lot of EVs and split out for defense. And you can do that with Manaphy, but its raw stats are just not enough to handle and to match up with the other guys in SV. So going into Miz, we were like, okay, Manaphy has to be dropped. And then obviously we had an Ursaluna that wasn't Terra, but we could very easily tell. I think it was Habido's team that had Ursaluna Blood Moon, and it was like popping off, and we're like, okay, this is obviously the right and the correct choice to make. It's the bulky offensive setup stereotype. At the same time, you can always go stab Terra and then just put a Choice Specs or a Silk Scarf on it and then nuke things in general. And I think that's like the ability to identify like what makes a strong Terra captain is what made us shift away from Manaphy into Ursaluna, and just the recognition that Manaphy is a fraud in general.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, for context, the entire board for DCL 1 was here over the course of, I believe it was 3 days.
Something like that.
Because the DLC dropped on Tuesday night, and we were like, we want to make sure this board is done by Friday. So that led to a lot of rush decisions, such as the Omnipon, as being said. Blame him for it, not me, I swear.
I still think Omnipon should be allowed, by the way, just like at 20 points. But that's
Terra legal?
Yeah, it was Terra legal. Maybe like with no Heart Flame, but that's a different story. I think
yeah, it gets too complicated.
Yeah, one other interesting thing of note here is this is sort of like when dual Terra captains kind of, I guess I wouldn't say like started to pop off, but like it was, you were seeing people much more often Terraing their secondary options this season in DCL compared to in DPO, where it's usually just you Terra your main guy and that's it. And that really opens the box, right? You have much more versatile options in prep once you are able to consider multiple options for Terra. Like I think this was a season where Hisuian Electrode popped off, Reverum popped off, and I'm probably missing a few mons as well. I think Oricorio also popped off this season when it comes to secondary Terras.
Yeah, Oricorio did as well.
Yeah, so it's like
I think this was obviously with this being the beginning of the 2 captain and sometimes point system, because it was kind of thought the consensus after the previous DL was that 2 captains together just wasn't going to be healthy enough and sustainable.
Right.
So given kind of still exploring. Yeah, people are kind of still exploring the low tier options. So you kind of you'd see some ones kind of get it a lot. Like if we like was one, you saw a lot of Terra Jolteon. Terra Earthring was another common one,
Oh, right. Terra Jolteon.
but it wasn't really super
Yeah.
refined yet. Yeah, it wasn't really super refined yet at this point. And I think you will kind of see as the drafts go on, you will see more refinement in those lower tier captains, especially around the point where it was moved from 2 captains 25 points to the 2 to 3 and 28 points as it is nowadays.
Right.
So moving on from this, unless you have anything else to say, like your experience with Terra Quackaball.
Oh, actually, that drop.
We innovated
that
the
drop-
Terra Water Fighting first, guys. It wasn't L5. Like
Actually, I'd say the main star of that draft is the Terra Gardevoir rather than Terra Quackable. Terra Gardevoir was, I'd say, a really good Terra captain. Mainly because
I love the Terra Captain.
yeah, you have like Trace to give it more flexibility. Again, that's another common theme. And then you have like a lot of different options and like Wisp, Vacuum Wave, Encore, and it's just a nuisance once you give it a Terra option. So it's like your ability to like figure out what you think is good will make a good draft. I think at the end of the day.
Super underscored Paramount in general. And I wouldn't really see more kind of as time goes on because it was this and then it was VBA season where Gypsy.
Yes, I took inspiration from Gypsy's draft to take Gardevoir in DCL1 because I saw how he used it in DGBA, and it was a really impressive showing of Terra Gardevoir's capabilities.
Yeah, it really was. But what was you expecting Gypsy? But the fact he was tearing this over Regieleki was just kind of testament to the potential that he's on them on, and I think that kind of follows in the district.
Right.
We now move on into the year of our Lord 2024, and that brings us to PCL Season 8. And these band tasters teams, you look at them on paper, and there's nothing like too crazy about them, but there is a couple of things to talk about here. One of them is that Craig is a psychopath with this SB3 draft, because could you really think of anyone that would use this other than Craig? I feel like the answer is no.
Well, Craig was a Terra Mew enthusiast, so yeah, I don't know why I say was. He still is.
It still is. Yeah, I think if you gave him this draft now, all he would do is attempt to make that Sableye Grimmsnarl. I think that's the only thing he would.
Oh no, you need a Sableye in this draft. He would keep the Sableye over the Grimmsnarl for sure.
Oh, yeah, he probably does need the Encore, doesn't he?
Yeah, and you need a Ghost. You definitely need a Ghost on this because a lot of reason spikes or T-spikes Mew. But yeah, I think this draft in general, this was the first season Darkrai was free, I believe. If I'm remembering.
Yeah, it was.
And again, it's just a lot of SV drafts. I think SV drafts mainly come down to the flexibility of your Terra captains. I think unlike old gens where the entire draft needs to be kind of cohesive to make a good draft, I think in SV, if you have good Terra captains and then you work around it, even if your other pieces seem underwhelming, the draft is going to do fine if you have a good Terra captain. And in this case, we had a strong Terra captain in Mew, and then we did have Ogerpon Cornerstone before, not Terra, before mids. Forgot what we dropped for it, or sorry, what we dropped it for. But I think it's probably Iron Moth because we realized we were getting destroyed by T-Spikes. So we picked up the regular Iron Moth. But I think the one notable thing about this draft, SV3 and then SV4, as I was talking about before we started recording, was a shift from a more bulkier archetype to just HO-esque drafts in general. Like you look at the SV4, you see Terapagos, Glimmer, Warring Moon, Iron Crown, Sinistra, and Aberrant. You're like, oh, this is a very standard draft nowadays, what you would see in pretty much any season probably. But I'd say this was kind of novel for his time, and you're sort of straying away from the standard Tinglu, Tornadus archetypes, the G King, Excalibur, G King Kyurem, the Zapdos Garchomps, the Garchomp, sorry, the Great Tusk, I don't know, the Great Tusk, whatever. You got my point. But it was a lot of bulky offense-esque drafts, whereas these two kind of lean into just pure offense. And I think this season as a whole, not like just these two drafts, but this season in DPL was kind of when that drafting style took off. And it became sort of the more common standard archetype compared to like the balance you would see was like Torrenti, Tinglu. And obviously we're sort of coming around to it now. We're going to talk about this later, but like now it's back to a more balanced archetype, but we'll be getting to that later. So
yeah, I want to bring that up. Like we will leave that to later when we kind of get into what to expect this season a little bit. Obviously, not spoiling anything because if you do Quantum Caster, you probably want to keep some stuff close to chest, and I don't blame you. The other thing in regards to these is this guy right here in Para Ogerpon. So Para Ogerpon is an interesting case because it was a very underexplored mon, and then it was drafted in this season. It did incredibly well, and then over the course of 6 months, it just completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And there was no major change in how draft sectors work. It wasn't like people all of a sudden started drafting more grass resist because of Ogerpon's existence. So I guess it is one of those, how do you recognize that this was the right time for Ogerpon, or was it a little bit of a case of getting a little bit lucky in circumstance?
Yeah.
Because this very easily could have gone down the same route as Terra Manaphy in the DCL.
Probably, yeah. I mean, stuff, so. I think I don't remember exactly why I was big on Terra Teopon at this point in time, but I think a lot of it was its ability to hold an item, as well as be elite speed control and just being strong, right? It's very strong after it Terras, despite not having the mask boost. But I think a lot of it was probably a combination of people not being prepared for how strong this guy was, or just underestimating this guy's power, as well as the team it's paired up with facilitated it well. Having spikes makes it so that it's not as easily checked by like stuff like Raging Bolt. And you have it's not like the best mon on the team, right? You still have the Great Tusk there, and you still have Samurott there, which are both very strong mons in their own right. And I do think, like, I remember a game specifically where it was Castilia vs Vinny, where we had Choice Band Ogerpon, and we clicked Woodhammer, and we just one-hit KO the Enamorous from full. And then we proceeded to also, like, one-hit KO the Tinkaton or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
So it's like I think people are underestimating it at this point, and once its potential sort of got revealed later, people were like, oh, we have to bring a max defense for this guy now, and so it's harder to get it to be more efficient then. So you would see a lot of like spikes or leech protect sets, or just utility encore sets later in the following seasons, and that's just not as it just doesn't look as impressive as like Choice Band Woodhammer, one-hit KOing two Pokemon that resist grass, right? So I think that's probably the main reason.
Yeah. And that ties into, I talked about this previously when I was talking about grasslands in general, and discussing the Ogerpon, of how there's been such a shift from what used to be a lot more in the direction of Wellspring and Steel, but now everyone's kind of pivoting over to Cornerstone and Hearth Flame as like a middle of the draft option because they're good breakers, have really nice secondary stats, while also having that utility. So we've definitely seen a major shift in that.
People recognize that, like, okay, we're using our 17-point Ogerpon as like a leech seed spiky shield guy, right? But I can also just do that with an 11-point non-terror Ogerpon. And you get that base 110 speed, you get spikes, you get leech protect, you get encore, you get strong U-turns, you get either Mold Breaker or Defiant or Sturdy, which are all great abilities. So it's like, I think that's kind of the evolution we saw with this mon, where people started to lean away. Or I guess like Harfang got banned, but like people started to lean away from Tealpon, and Rockpon was just never drafted in general. So I guess I wouldn't call it a lean away. Yeah. Like, people just adapted it, the non-terror form of Ogerpon more recently.
You can say that, but then if you look back at Omnipon's Reign of Terror, people used Rockpon more than they used Tealpon. So I guess that's something.
Yeah, I do say I will say Omnipod is a bit
That's
anomaly
Omnipod.
in that case, since you should always just be using Heartflame or
Yeah.
well,
Just ever so slightly. And then fast forward a couple months and we get to DCL 2. And I'd say the easiest place to start is with Sun. Because Sun had been briefly explored in the previous DPL, but in a very different way. That was more so kind of Sun tacked on to the end of a top 4 that just happened to have a Roaring Moon on it, and it just kind of worked. Whereas this seemed a little more kind of preordained, I would say, after the cusp. Although maybe Zappa could disagree.
yeah. Well,
How
I
did
think
we kind of approach?
this is probably one of my favorite drafts I've made recently. This started off with Tusk Zapdos and then Roaring Moon. I don't remember what we had before Bronzong prior to mids. Yeah, it might have been a Fortress there for all I can know. But I think a lot of it is just yeah, a lot of it just
We can find out.
you once you pick up Great Tusk and Roaring Moon, I think you automatically are thinking like, oh, that's 2 mons I can benefit from Sun. So we're definitely going to consider it. Yeah, it was Fortress.
Yeah, it wasn't called Life.
Yeah.
Classic.
But I think what was so interesting about this draft was at least the way I envisioned it. It's a draft that can operate both inside of Sun and outside of Sun. I think a lot of Sun drafts' main issue is they draft a team that is completely reliant on the Sun side of coming. An example of this, I'd say, is like people get like Walking Wake plus Venusaur plus, and it adds like a 2-mon core. And like those 2 mons really only operate in Sun. Like you can say Walking Wake can operate outside of Sun, but honestly, that mon is terrible and trash if it's not under Sun. And I think over reliance on Sun is actually the downfall of most Sun teams, funny enough. Whereas this team, SV3, I think is the exact opposite of that. It circumvents the issue that traditional HO would have, such as being weak to T-Spikes, with the Iron Moth pick as a potential Sun abuser. But it also operates as like a potentially defensive team, where if you take the top 3, you take the Steel type, you take the Iron Moth, that's a very good team in its own right, even without Sun. And now you tack on the Terra Hisuian Lilligant as well as like another potential Sun abuser, and it's just a very menacing team to prep for. I know Kaif used this team mostly in this season, and he really liked the Sun mode. There's a lot of weeks where like you could explore a non-Sun mode, but like he always ended up preferring the Sun mode over the non-Sun mode. So I think this team's potential wasn't fully met, but it still performed great, right? It went on to get a 5-2 record. So I think it partially is just this team is like, I think what's so great about it is the fact that it's not actually leaning into the Sun as heavily as one would expect of a standard Sun team, and that's what makes it so good.
I guess this brings us on to the conversation of weather in general, because I do think people prefer to experiment with weather in individual events compared to team tours. Do you think we're kind of hitting a point where, especially now that teams will have 5 SV drafts, do you think teams will be that little bit more open to experimenting with weather? I know Sun is kind of the primary topic of conversation, and I'm excluding the basic, like, oh, I'm going to put Silly Reception, my Gallic Sloping, into this Excalibur. Like, we'll skip over that.
Yeah,
But
I
do you
think
think that could be something that works for?
There's definitely room to experiment, and I think echoing sort of what I said before, the downfall of a lot of experiments is hyper specialization in one specific thing. Like I think there's a lot of teams that could utilize that can experiment around with like modes such as terrain, for example. You can get yourself a terrain guy plus a unburden guy, like we saw previously with Sneezer. But I think the main thing is that you cannot lean into one specific mode entirely, and that kind of ruins a draft for me. And I think it's the same with like rain or snow. If you lean into it too heavily, and it becomes like your primary option, I think that's when the draft falls apart. I think when it comes to weather and like more specialized stuff such as terrain in general, they should come more natural. rather than it being a necessary sort of option in your draft as a whole.
And I guess the last thing I want to bring up as we look at these teams is the specific combination of Parasense and Iron Law, because this became an incredibly common core during this era, and it still is to this day. I'm not sure if it got usage in the previous DPL prior to you guys, but I guess it is just, why was it this specific duo? And was it just something that you felt like it was just a good fit and they complement each other well, which has just kind of been communally accepted?
Yeah, I think this draft specifically was sort of the tipping point of what's going back into more balanced vibes for drafting in general. This draft was primarily used by Sean, but you see how solid of a defensive core this draft has, right? You see Tin Liu and Rodan Wash and Dragonite. That pretty much covers like every typing out there, maybe except for like Fairy.
Yeah.
It's very solid defensively, and then you tackle on Sinistra and Iron Moss, who has a naturally good stuff. Like we saw people run Struggle Bug Iron Moss this season to check Raging Bull and whatnot. And you have Carbink and Fortress, which are also decent moms for their price. Like Carbink is like 3 points now, I think. It's a very defensively solid team in general, which made it so that these two Terramons specifically had a lot of room to shine because of the flexibility and the defensive pivoting options you have in the remainder of your draft. And I think the key thing to note there is that all of these guys can run either an offensive set or a defensive set. Like Wash Tom can put on pressure with Nasty Plot or Scarfer. Sinistra can run Plot. You can run Trick Room Policy, which Sean run a lot. Iron Moss could be split of Toxic Morning Sun or Specs or Booster. Ting Lu can be Adamant, which we pretty much always was, actually. And obviously, D-Knight also has the capabilities to be defensive and offensive. The really only Pokemon that's you could argue can't really be defensive is like Greninja, which was our speed control guy, so that makes sense. But I think what was unique about this two combinations specifically in this draft is the fact that they're not stuck performing one specific role. It's not like Sinistcha has to be the spin blocker here. It can be a offensive set in its own right with Terra and Trick Room. It's not like Ting Lu always has set hazards. We have Carbink and Fortress. It's not like Iron Moss always has to be offensive. It can be split up as well, and then you can make your Greninja the breaker or the Sinistcha the breaker. And I think that's what's so nice about this draft and why people emulated it a lot after this season.
Yeah, I completely agree with you in regards to what you said in terms of this was the beginning of reverting back to a slightly bulkier archetype. I think it was a combination of this, the Armory team that L5 was spamming, which leaned a lot more into balance, and the Trick of Ice team post-mids that Lax was piloting with the Terra Thunder T, Terra Fairlight. I think we kind of got a lot more into an era where flexibility was seen as way more important than offensive power. And that is what has led us now into this more balanced meta game where you see a lot more spike stack, you see a slightly slower paced game, but it's a lot more methodical in terms of positioning and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the stats from this season of DPL, you'll see like all the top mons are Tornti, Alumomola, Petra, Yaskarada, I think. These are all like mons.
Yeah, spoilers, we haven't gotten to that one yet.
Yeah, but you see that like now it's mainly meta revolved around positioning and pivots. There's a funny meme of people saying drafters only click U-turn, volt switch, flip turn, which is kind of true at this point in the generation.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely one of those things of the comment on later. And the prime example of that was I forget which pool game it was, but I'm pretty sure you just clicked momentum move for half the game.
And that was like all this games. You're going to have to narrow it down more.
Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, moving on, we then get to the recently concluded Draft Premier League Season 9. And we get to these teams, where I feel like there's... Oh, that's the wrong set of teams, is it? No, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I thought I was still on the BUI teams from discussions earlier. So SB1 we will ignore because this is just who being who. And
I mean,
spoiler alert,
it's a
who is
great
good at
game.
the beginning.
It's a great game.
It, yeah, it's a phenomenal team that he will never be able to get again. I don't think.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I mean, Petron and Mola round. I mean, you can probably get those guys round 3, round 4 still, but they're more expensive now. Well,
I think the issue now is the rounding Hydraulic on the round 5 Caldio.
yeah, round 5
Especially
Caldio
now that
won't be a thing anymore, and the Hydrapple is also more expensive.
I'm pretty sure you can't get them both legally now as a pair captain duo. I think Ghosting Tour, you could get them both for 28, but I think now Caldio's gonna.
I don't
So
think you can
I
get
don't
them
think you
both
can actually
for
get them both.
28 anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, who your team got absolutely destroyed, but you did too well.
Well, you say that, but then this guy, they're playing drafting Ghosting Tour, and they got Terratorn, Mola, Petrant still, so they just got an upgraded version of this team. So
Yeah, pretty much. Doll never dies, huh? Right when we got rid of Theo and everything. But then SB4, probably not a lot to talk about. This Raging Bolt was picked up at mids. No, it was not left till round 3. It's just Dino Crisis got annoyed and decided, yeah, let's get a Terra Hydrapple instead of a Terra Raging Bolt.
yeah.
Less said about that, the better. This team was doing well before it. Like, it was a Terra Gliscor squad that you were piloting a fair bit.
Before we blew it up to fit the Raging Bolt.
Yeah. But that is a perfect example of when you're in cores like this and you see, and you know what, it kind of applies to league play as well. Of if you see a drop that you're like, this mon is too good to have been dropped, that sometimes it's just worth, even if you think your team's good enough, to just kind of tear it apart for that other piece, because it could give you your team that entirely extra dimension, which could take it to the next level. So keep that in mind, kids. Let's see, is there any? I guess this SV2 was another one. This was L5 was using it a fair bit, and it kind of ties back to the team that we just said with Sean, to kind of approach it in a slightly different manner.
It's a very defensive, or I guess I wouldn't say it's a defensive team, but it's a team with a very solid defensive backbone, so that gives it more options when team building, because every mon can be both offensive and defensive.
And I think across the board, you look at these teams and you compare them to the beginning, and there's far less breakers. There's far less, setup pieces. It is that little bit slower, like we said. Like, your immediate power across the board, you're getting from what? Vex Keldeo, maybe the odd breaker here. This is a Lucas draft, so of course nothing breaks. And then obviously Valiant and Raging Bolt.
Yeah, a lot of it is like the realization that very offensive drafts can get shut down pretty easily now by just pivots and regenerator. You can just cycle infinitely between AV Tornadus and AV Alomomola and Petron, and then your average like Roaring Moon and Amorous cannot break through that, unfortunately. Well, you have to be like you have to be prepped very specifically to be able to break that core, and I think people have not caught on to how you can break that cycle of regen plus pivot moves reliably yet.
Yeah, and that segues just perfectly into something we briefly alluded to earlier in terms of the trends that we saw from this DPL season and going into DCL, what we're expecting to see. And you've mentioned it already, plenty of times. Like, we talked about even Thornset, we talked about Pectorunt, we talked about Alomomola. Like, do you think that the next stage of where SD drafting is going is to try to deal with these guys, or are we going to see a lot more of, well, if you can't beat them, join them?
Well, I think the natural, like if you go to the Pokemon stats page, right, on the EPL Season 9 doc, you'll see the win rates are absolutely absurd for these guys. And so I think the consequence of that is going to be that these guys are both their point value is going to skyrocket, and then B, they're going to be drafted much earlier. And I think a natural consequence of that is that these drafts aren't going to be as powerful as before. Like a very classic example of this is Zarude's fall off, right? Previously, when Zaru was on the come up,
100%.
it was round 2, Predators Iron Valiant, and those drafts were doing phenomenally well. Like you were seeing Zaru sweeps left and right. But this season, when Zaru has met its peak already, it's getting drafted round 1. It's getting paired with like Cinderace round 2, and it's just like it's been abysmal this season. It's had like a generational fall off pretty much. So I think a natural consequence of these drafts doing well at this DPL is that it's going to be much harder to assemble these types of drafts in DCL. Alomomola, Petron, Torn, Masquerada, they're going to be taken much earlier than they used to. Like Torn T, you could feasibly get it probably like pick 6, 7 this season, maybe in round 2. You are not going to be able to get that in DCL. It's probably going to be a top 4 mon, if even top 3, most likely. Petron, Mola, you could probably get them round 4, round 5. Now they're going to go round 3, round 4, I'd imagine. So I think naturally the team's overall power levels, or like these pivot style teams' overall power levels are going to decrease since it's going to be harder to assemble these guys. And I think a lot of people are going to attempt to join it, but unsuccessfully, is my guess. I think we will see a lot of these poorly created regenerator drafts exposed in DCL.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate portrayal. I just have the DCL 3 tiering up here. Ooh, that's worse. Not today's problem. This is not the finalized, because for some reason it didn't cover over properly. But just to kind of show some of the changes, the main one here, Alomomola, as we said, it's gone up to 10. Petron did not get as much of a price increase as I would have liked. Like, I personally think the Petron could have gone to 14, maybe even 15.
You see how I voted 12 on Petron?
What is wrong with you?
I think a lot of my philosophy is around the fact that, like, I don't think support mon should be racing the moon. I think the natural consequence of support mons becoming better is that they're just going to be drafted earlier, and that's the opportunity cost to draft another good Pokemon. So I don't mind leaving it at 12/13 for another season and to see how it goes. Because I think, even though it seems extremely broken right now, I feel like once it starts getting taken earlier in the draft, it might be more manageable and feasible. At least that's my prediction. I could be completely off after DCL, and I'll be like, oh, we're going to move this up. But we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll definitely see. Like, because I was having this conversation with other people, that obviously we have a top 7, right? You have your 4 that are clearly the best guys that don't Terra, being, your Valley, your Meowscarada, your Tropicus, and your Great Color. You still Terra it sometimes, but it's not needed. And then your 3 Terra captains, right? Of your Tornti, your Raging Bulls, and your Zarude. Although Zarude might move further down. You then kind of get to the point of what is the most optimal wheel. And I think arguably your most optimal wheel could be Roaring Moon Petron.
It was a terrible of the meta for that to be the optimal wheel.
It sums it up perfectly.
And I frankly don't think that draft will do well if you start off with Roaring Moon Petron. Unless you get very lucky with your remaining pieces. Because I don't think Mola comes back to you for round 3, round 4. And you're gonna have to fit like a Terra Hydrapple somewhere as well, or like a Terra, or like a good Terra Captain, like a Terra Mew, probably.
Well, I do think we will probably see people try to get mini Terra Hydrapples in quotations, of people trying to replace what it can do. I'm not quite sure what that option is yet, but I'm sure people figure it out. Going back to these win percentages, the other thing that I wanted to mention that I think could be quite common is, obviously, you look at Dragonite's win percentage here, you look at Garchomp's win percentage, you look at Raging Bolt's usage this season. I think this was a season where we saw a lot of the fairies not get drafted for one reason or another, and I think they're all going to come steaming back. I'd say Hatterene's usage is going to skyrocket again, solely because people are having removal problems with the Hazard stack plus reliable Ghost type, right? So Magic Bounce kind of makes sense in that regard. And then I do think you will see fairies in general, because I'm pretty sure the most drafted fairy in DPL was Carving, which just kind of
Carbon is a
sums it up.
god, bro.
Doesn't it?
Well, I think
Still.
the best fairy types are Terra Fairy, so it's you don't really need.
Yeah, I would agree. But I think people will go more natural fairies so that they don't feel as forced in breath. That's just kind of another hunch that I have, but I think I'm wrong on that. But I do think Katharine's kind of the main one in my head that I see that using going back up.
I think the main
Possibly.
the main niche of Garchomp is it's starting to like overtake potentially Tinlu as the premier ground type of the generation. Because it has the ability to set spikes like Tinglu, but it also has the ability to do other stuff, right? Like Tinglu is going to be bulkier, but Garchomp obviously is an offensive threat sometimes. It's a decent scarfer, but it can also provide the spikes that Tinglu does as well. But and I think Dragonite's just really good in SV in the meta where a lot of Pokemon are fast and offensive, having a strong E speed as well as a guaranteed boots multi-scale makes you very valuable in this generation.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I do agree with you. And it is definitely a case of it's a perfect summation of how the metagame goes because as it's gotten more offensive, we have come to a point where you used to see a lot more offensive Dragon, right? You saw a lot more Dragon Z speed, and then now what you're seeing is you're seeing a lot more support-based Dragonite, and that's because the metagame has gotten a bit slower. So it's kind of a perfect mon to summarize the state of the metagame. Any other final thoughts in terms of what to expect as we, the auction's only a few weeks away, which means drafting is what, about 3 weeks away at this point?
Something like that, yeah. Ish. Yeah. I think I'm going to make a few predictions, maybe. I think Terrapagos is going to fall off.
Ooh. That's a fun one.
Scribble would be that, but I was that big. I think Terrapagos has been boosted too much. I think it's at 18 points now. I think, and I think that's going to be too much for
it. Yeah, it went up again. I think you were the only person who keep it 17.
No, I think I voted 16 for it, if I remember correctly.
Well, might have, yeah. I was looking at this earlier.
I think it's when it was last month.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, you voted 16.
I think Terrapagos is pretty overhyped in general. You rarely see it sweep anymore, like as a calm mind set. So it's really just like it's kind of just like worse, or not worse, but like it's kind of like it offers the same role as Dragonite in a lot of senses, except it trades that priority for the ability to be able to spin, which is pretty important. But at the same time, it's like I don't think it's worth 18 points. And I think if it is at 18 points, we'll see it fall off this season. At least that is my prediction.
Also, if we are making predictions, I think this thing is probably going to get a lot more usage than people think. I think people have definitely grown on that hugely in the last couple of months.
The pivot flying guys has been picking up usage, right? Like Corviknight's also been picking up usage because of his ability to slow U-turn, and and then people have been realizing that like spinning is like a impossible side quest in SV a lot of the time, or like not impossible, but it's like a complete mini game in and of itself within a Pokemon game in SV Draft. So like you might as well just get yourself a defogger and save yourself from having to play that mini game.
Yeah, and that does kind of tie back to Mandible and Corviknight because they're kind of the only two that reliably do it, unless I'm like, you don't want to run defense Dizzle in 2025.
Yeah.
Unless you have to.
Pretty bad.
Yeah. Any other wild predictions? You would love to be wild?
I think that's my main one. I think Terrapagos is going to fall off. Although I guess it wasn't like that highly rated anyways, even though it's still getting its points still getting raised. I don't really understand why. But
yeah. The thing ties back into what we kind of mentioned earlier about the Ogerpon. This will probably get more usage.
I'd say so, yeah.
I don't think that'll be too surprising.
More usage.
I think we'll get more usage. Speak on the topic of kind of the more middling Terracastans. Like, it was on that one Dino Crisis feed that did like super well.
Yeah, I'd say like if people are willing to experiment more with two middle tier turret captains rather than like one strong guy, one weak guy, Keytran would be one of the primary ones to consider.
Yeah, and I guess we'll just pull up the draft board here for this last bit because it shows the rate of being drafted, which I think is an interesting look at if people ever want to do that, just in terms of kind of recognizing trends, recognizing, oh, why is this thing going in? Stuff like that. Because what was really interesting about this season was that people kind of didn't really have definitive low tiers. Like, I think under the price of 10, there's only like 4 mons that went in every draft, and one of them was a carbon.
Yeah, Carbon's
So,
like that.
yeah. We didn't mention carbon 4 times in this video.
It's actually broken.
Well, I'd say
it's dual hazards and it checks Darkrai. Like, what more can you ask from like a 3-point mod?
exactly. Yeah, because I'm pretty sure it's like carbon doing Quillfish, I think is another one that got taken in every draft. Something like that. Yeah, there we go. I feel like we are going to see a more streamlined approach to low tiers in general. Like, I'd say this thing will come back into prevalence. We might see more of this thing. People are kind of growing on Arachid more now that kind of, like you said, about the rapid spin minigame. So it just makes webs better. So, this is the Duck Weber.
Cyclosaur probably sees an uptake in usage. Valuable probably gets drafted a few more times.
Yeah. But I do think in general we will see a more streamlined approach to low tiers compared to this season where you did see it really went all over the place in terms of what draft towards the end of drafts.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times spinning out rolls, right? You want your grounded poison, you want your cheap spinner. It's really 100% on the context of things. I wouldn't say I'd be surprised if we get like a very streamlined low tier as well. To be honest, I think it's going to be more scattered. At least I would assume, I would think it's going to be more scattered.
Yeah, that's highly plausible. I just think I was looking at these and I was like, there's a lot of months that just kind of only got drafted once. So I feel like either people are going to look at it and be like, oh, this thing did well, and then draft it more, or you're just not going to see usage of stuff at all. Like, are we really going to see a Brambleghast for DCL? No.
Some people are huge Brambleghast fans.
It's just not good in Hitmon.
Yeah.
Like, are you going to see Pilot? I doubt it. That's going to be 4. That could well be 4.
Well, these guys are so expensive now, so it's hard to justify them now, but they're still good mons, so.
Yeah, Roden is just phenomenal in what it can do right now. Anyways, I have just now realized that we've been yapping for almost an hour. You probably want to get some sleep. So, we should probably get wrapping this up.
Yeah.
I hope you guys all enjoyed this relatively long ramble through the thought process of drafting the team tours and kind of why it's approached in a slightly different manner. And I hope people are able to kind of take a few learnings from this, even if it is kind of translating this over to EFL if people don't get drafted in DCL, which is highly plausible. The lineups I imagine is stacked enough. So it's just kind of taking, being able to learn from this. I hope people kind of found it enjoyable in that regard. And thank you once again, Zing, for joining me for this ridiculously long ramble.
Of course.
And any final parting words?
No, I hope to see everybody sign up for DCO and DFL. Always exciting to see. I think a lot of new blood is popping up recently. In general, as the old guards are starting to fade. Well, not fade away, but they're starting to be overtaken by newer players recently. I think it's a very exciting time for draft as well, despite us being in our 3rd year of SV. So,
yeah, 100%. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, let me know. And if you have any other topic suggestions for things that I want to cover before DCL begins, let me know. I do have a video in the works where I go over the team building aspects, where I'll have another guest joining me. And then I also plan on reviewing my games from last year and things like that. So if there's any other topics that people want me to kind of go over, or any other guests that people would like me to try get on, let me know. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next video.